Hey everyone, thanks for joining us at Groundbreak today. Really excited for this event. I'm really excited to be sitting here today with Jay Bowman, Principal at FMI. I know you have a lot of choices in the topics you choose. Really glad that you stopped by here today. Obviously a very important topic, one that a lot of folks are thinking about, essentially the intersection of technology, economics, politics, and construction. The pandemic in 2020 has changed the way we act as human beings, has also changed the way construction is delivered, and it's changed the way that governments are looking at the present and at the future. Economic policy is changing on a dime, political structures are changing, and the way that we are reacting today will potentially have broader ramifications for a long time to come. So really excited about this topic. Again, really excited to have Jay here. For those of you who haven't met Jay, Jay is a principal at FMI, also managing director of research and analytics. And over the past 20 years, he's helped FMI become the largest provider of management consulting and investment banking for the built environment. As managing director of research, Jay advises clients on a range of strategic decisions, including business diversification, market entry, and competitive positioning. He also co-authors FMI's annual US and Canada Markets Construction Overview, one of the most widely read in North America. Jay also provides pro bono assistance to several industry groups, including the Associated General Contractors of America and the AEC Business Builders Forum. Jay also serves on the Alumni Board of Directors for the University of Georgia's Terry College of Business. Jay earned his MBA from East Carolina University and a BBA in risk management from the University of Georgia, which is a fantastic resume. So I'm sure, Jay, you're sitting there and you're probably a bit embarrassed when you hear that every time, but very impressive and great to have you on today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jazz. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you as well. I really do appreciate the time.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, let's dive in. We were short on time and we've got lots to get through. Anytime you tell someone that they're going to get through the whole topic of technology, construction, and economics in 30 minutes, they're probably lying, but I'm hopeful we can get to some really good answers here in the next little bit. Let's kick off. I think it's hard to start any presentation on this topic in 2020 without referencing the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. I'd love to get your perspective on where you think we are as an industry today as a result of the pandemic and what the near-term outlook looks like economically. For you, Jay, I'd love to know, like, what have been some of the surprises and how do you think this has been a catalyst in regards to what's going to happen in the future and what we should potentially be looking out for as an industry? What are some of the things that concern you and where do you see some positives and some optimism?
Absolutely. And you're exactly right. I mean, this cannot be, I'll say, underestimated in terms of the impact it's had. And while there's obviously the reality of the current situation we find ourselves in and the significant impact that it will have on our industry overall, I actually am fairly optimistic too, which I know sounds a little perhaps strange in this environment. But what I mean by that is if you think that our industry overall typically lags the overall economy by about 1.5 to 2 years, the fact that what we have seen from a potential recovery at an accelerated rate helps us feel that, well, the downturn that we may experience over the next year or 2 years could be somewhat softened as a result of that. And I think there's plenty of reasons to be positive. I mean, it's hard to say that in some cases because you think here in Canada, in the second quarter of 2020, it was almost a 39% decline in GDP. For the US, it was 33%. These are multitudes larger than any past single decline in GDP. And there's no way around how that will have a significant impact on construction activity. But at the same time, we've seen the stimulus activity in Canada. We're seeing some of the return of some of the economic activity. If oil prices can improve, with the western part of the country improving, that will have a huge lift for the rest of the nation. And in the US, we've already seen an additional 10.5 million jobs in the private sector, which is half of those that were lost. Manufacturing in both countries looks fairly positive from a rebound perspective. The PMI is at about an 18-month high, and retail activity is really improving. And we think how much consumer activity drives both economies in Canada and the U.S. That's a very positive sign. But again, there's no way to ignore the impact we're likely to see over the next 1.5 to 2 years.
That's great. And I think, to your point, Jay, one thing we saw early on in the pandemic in Canada, at least, was a real sense of belt tightening around the construction delivery and construction activity. And I think that became a bit more loose as people got to grips with what a safe job site actually meant during a pandemic. And I think there's a level of preparedness that's sort of come in the last few months, which I think gives me some optimism that regardless of a second wave, we'll be in a position to continue to deliver against the projects that are in pipeline, in addition to adding new work. So I feel really good about that. One sort of follow-on question. I don't have, I'm not asking you to be a medical professional, but have you given any thought to what a second wave looks like, and if this gets further protracted in the absence of a vaccine?
Yeah, so we have looked at both of those potential impacts to what would happen from an industry perspective. And despite what is kind of commonly said about our industry, I do think that the AEC industry is rather creative in how we approach things. I mean, as you just mentioned, Jazz, the way in which we were able to quickly determine as an industry, how can we reopen a job site safely? If there were to be an increase in, say, new cases, I actually remain positive that given what we've learned, with some of the tracking from the fast testing that's able to occur now, that it wouldn't have the same type of impact that we saw earlier in the year. We've just learned to navigate it better. But I would come back to one thing that you said, and you used the term catalyst, and I couldn't agree with you more that in many ways, what this pandemic has become more than anything is a catalyst for change, meaning those things that we may have considered to be impractical, from an industry perspective, say before the pandemic, are increasingly seen as practical now. And this will reshape in many cases, not only the way in which we deliver construction services, as you mentioned, with safety protocols, but also what types of facilities will be required on the back end of this.
Gotcha. I think that the natural desire is to ask you, how has it been the catalyst? I think those are going to be some of the follow-on questions here. Maybe we should get into those. So one of the things that I was really curious about was where you see, we're talking about some positives, potentially some negatives, some softness, depending on how things play out. Where do you see real positivity in terms of that notion of catalyst? Are there specific industries or industry segments that you think will benefit more greatly from this rapid change and rapid onset of change?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's so important to keep in mind is that regardless of the economy we find ourselves in, this concept that bull markets and bear markets coexist at all times. And we can go back to any period of economic expansion or even economic contraction, and we find whether it's certain markets or geographies that are either growing or declining, segments or types of construction that are growing or declining, we see this pattern go on. And it will be no different this time around. So even if we may see, say, like a 2-year period of decline, if we follow the traditional trajectory of our industry following a recession, there are several segments that we think will continue to grow regardless of the direction of the economy. And there's probably about 6 of these that seem most positive. So the first one's really in the biotech and life sciences segment. And this was actually a segment that we actually saw growing prior to the pandemic. And it was really a reflection of the evolution of small molecule therapies to biologics. And with that change, the exclusivity periods on biologics can be 12 years versus 5 if we're talking about a small molecule therapy. So there's a ton of activity and growth in that. Now with the arrival of the pandemic and how that has revealed how, I'll say, reliant we are on foreign sources for certain medications, that will bring some of the reshoring activity, but that's one that's really growing. With e-commerce, we've seen more e-commerce growth in the last 3 months than we did in the past 10 years combined. And with that, the amount of distribution activity we're seeing, but particularly even in cold storage, because with technology improvements and now same-day delivery, we're at the point where we've opened up the other half of the consumer economy, if you will, with perishable goods. So think of grocery deliveries and things of that nature. Data centers continue to grow at an exponential rate. And it's not just the hyperscale or these million square foot size facilities, it's a lot of upgrades to the class 1s and class 2s and bringing those up to even a higher grade of data center. Then even in the, I'll say the intelligent transportation systems, particularly as we move to more electronic vehicles and all the sensors that are out there, more and more things that we'll have to do in order to really understand, how we're going to pay for infrastructure construction going forward. And then lastly, really around wind power, particularly wind power as it is associated with solar. And this is particularly interesting in the US. It's the fastest growing source of power. In the states of Iowa and Kansas, for example, it's already the largest provider of power. But when I look at sort of these different segments as really strong growth ones, what's interesting about it is you have to start saying, okay, well, are the drivers, are they market driven or are they policy driven? Because if it's policy driven, it can be taken away relatively quickly, right? But since most of these are very market driven, again, there's a lot of reasons to be positive about where these markets may go.
Got it. And then if you take a sort of a step into traditional sort of ICI type of work, one of the things that stands out is the potential shift in office space and how office space is looked at going forward. Some have classed this as potentially the death of offices, right? Others are probably more optimistic in the sense that, like you and I are both, at least I'm in my house. So, I'm tempted to get out and get back into an office as well, because I think sometimes we lack that social touch point with people. I think it's the death of the office, but how do you see that evolution occurring over the next couple of years? And how do you see, big downtown cores that have been reliant on office space and people commuting into the urban centers? How do you see that changing? And do you see more of a shift towards a more distributed type of model?
Right. Well, I think there's two ways you could look at it. One is you could say, well, this is a permanent shift, and you would almost describe it in detrimental terms to office construction. The other side, or the other argument you could make, is that, well, people have short memories, right? And we see this over and over again. And what we think we're heading, this will absolutely never change. In a couple of years, people shift back and they start falling back into their old patterns. I think what you'll probably see, and this is probably taking a little bit of the easy way out, but I think it's going to be a combination of the two. And if you were to ask me, I think over the next, say, year or 2 years, what you'll eventually see is probably 25% of office workers will never return. They will be completely remote. Because in most cases, a lot of companies who used a lot of office space are finding a lot of ways to be more efficient. There's a profitability aspect to it, obviously, of having less footprint. And so I wouldn't be surprised again if 25% just never return. Another 25% will likely come in, say, 1 or 2 days a week. So that will still require some place to be because of team meetings and other work that just has to be done in an office environment, which leaves roughly 50% that would return on a full-time basis. So it will change the way in which we think about office space. It will probably bring with it a lot of actual TI improvements, thinking like front office and back office. Think about in some cases where you visited, say, a client's office, and to get to a boardroom or the CEO's office, you have to wind through multiple, cubicle farms and everything to finally get back. You may see a shift of that where visitors, everything that would have a visitor's aspect to it be moved to the front and everything else pushed to the back. So there could be some of that. And then just like after 9/11 and what was required from an aviation standpoint of adding security checkpoints and everything else to an office, to an airport environment, I think we'll see a lot of the same things with how do we do this so that if another pandemic comes, which will at some point, we're in a better position to react to it.
Gotcha. On a sort of a economic note here, Jay, again, sort of just sticking with the types of projects. I know public infrastructure and publicly funded projects has been a big topic in the US and Canada for that matter. And Canada has traditionally been very strong on public-private partnerships. So two questions, I guess. One is, how do you see the public funds actually entering the economy in a way in which they're going to be available, ready for use, so that we'll have shovel-ready projects that we can start getting into? How does that tap actually get turned on? Are you seeing evidence of that happening today? And then secondly, what's the role of public-private partnerships, both in the US and Canada, for the foreseeable future?
Right. Well, I'm more positive about the outlook for public infrastructure in Canada than I am in the US. Both segments or sectors of the construction industry, I should start though by saying, is they don't typically experience the same highs and lows as, say, residential construction or even non-residential building construction. So, it's a relatively moderate sort of change that you see. Still, Canada has a much more robust P3 market already, which facilitates the acceleration of investment into needed public infrastructure that just simply doesn't exist in the US. I think there's still many hurdles and obstacles, even with what we've seen from a pandemic perspective, that doesn't make it an overnight sort of solution, if you will, for the US. Rather, I think what will be done in the US is we have our current FAST Act that is expiring. What will be the next one probably will not bring a lot of increase in funding. So again, things will be continually pushed to the local governments. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, with the intelligent transportation systems, particularly like electronic tolling and things of that nature, you'll see more of that. But as that begins to become more common, I think that could actually be the door that opens for P3 in the US with proven revenue sources coming from the local and state deployment of electronic tolling.
Gotcha. And I think we're in a situation, at least in the States, where we're, 12 weeks, 8 weeks away from an election, yes, which could fundamentally alter the face of that country. And I think that those are always tricky times to institute and follow through on any new policy. So probably some trickiness there as well, I imagine.
And we've studied that. And it's interesting, when we've seen a new president be elected, whether it's a continuation of the same party or it's a shift in party, construction actually doesn't dramatically change in the first 2 years of their term. It's really the second 2 years where we start to see really whether it's an increase or a decrease. So even if we were to have a change in parties this time around, the likelihood, if it follows past precedent, is that the construction spending itself wouldn't dramatically change as a result over the next 2 years.
Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit here, Jay, and dive a little bit into the third topic for the day, which is technology. And I think if we look at the fact that economically there's been a bit of a shift, the way people are thinking about the future has changed in the absence of, a known state, I guess, for lack of a better term. There's been evidence, at least from my perspective, of folks diving into digital solutions and looking to digitally transform their businesses in order to drive greater efficiencies. Depending on the sector that you're in, whether it's been negatively impacted or positively impacted, to me, efficiency is always a really important keyword in this industry. As you think out about the technological landscape, how do you see technology positively impacting construction? And has there been a catalyst, again, going back to our original question, as a result of the pandemic that is further adding fuel to the fire for digital transformation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that with the pandemic, the acceleration in the use of technology will be one of the major outcomes. We were already sort of on that pathway. Like you said, this was just the fuel to the fire, particularly as we had to move people to remote working. And now there's more interaction digitally than ever before, having to understand how do you navigate that? Because I think particularly in the contractor side of the world, we really have to approach this idea of technology as an ecosystem, meaning that we have multiple solutions and parts in place, if you will, but how do you create a situation where the sum is greater than the individual parts of that ecosystem? And so how do you make it all work together? And so in many cases, I think what will differentiate the most successful contractors versus those that struggle is really addressing that situation of understanding how do I create sort of a digital solution across all types of platforms and across all job functions as well. So that will be one of the more important things from a competitive positioning, I think, for contractors moving forward.
Gotcha. And when you talk about a platform-based approach, an ecosystem of sorts, that to me sounds like an aggregation of data, and like, so the natural question for me from that is like, if you're bringing together multiple solutions or multiple job types or multiple data points into a single platform or ecosystem, how do you extract that data? How do you leverage that data? And how do you gain insight from that data? Like, what's your perspective on that? And the reason I ask the question is because I think historically, as a business or as an industry, construction has not been able to leverage the insights that the data provides, and often, only scratching the surface at the most, surface level of key insights and KPIs. To me, there's a natural evolution where that starts to shift. Have you seen that in your research as well?
We have. I mean, there's more data and information available to people now than ever before. And the question is really the quality of that data, right? And how, like to your point, how do you leverage that? And so when I think of that ecosystem approach, it's not just the tools themselves or the data sources, it's the individuals that have to interact with it. So everyone from the field, to the C-suite. And when those decisions are made about how we intend to select and deploy certain digital solutions, we have to keep in mind those individuals, particularly at the front line, that are going to be the ones using this on a day-to-day basis. And it's the analogy of the chain, right? Any weak link and the chain breaks. And if we aren't doing that on the front end of the actual individuals that will be responsible for use of that data and making decisions and leveraging it, then really sort of that chain continues to just break on us.
Got it. And one of the things I think came up in the FMI 2020 report that was recently released was how little people who were surveyed felt like the data itself was being used, right? So just the fact that the data is there, but there's no one really using that data to make anything actionable, I think sort of further substantiates your point.
Right. And I think that also just falls from the standpoint of so many solutions are siloed. To your point, it's just how do you aggregate it? Because if it is siloed, it is a lot of data, it's a lot of information, but it's not necessarily usable. We're very aware of the data that we're creating. So much of it is unstructured data now, which makes it even more difficult to use, whether we're talking about text files and satellite imagery and whatever else, not easily searchable. And so having that broader perspective, that ecosystem perspective is critical, particularly as we just continue to create more and more of this unstructured data.
As we near the end of the rapid fire 30 minutes, Jay,
Yes.
I thought it might be interesting just to close out with some of your key thoughts. Like if you had a few key takeaways you wanted to leave the audience with today, knowing sort of the background that they come from, and most, many of them today obviously are Canadian customers or people evaluating Procore. Now, what sort of advice would you give them from a technology perspective, but also more importantly, from an overall economic outlook perspective as well, so that they can start making the right decisions in their business as they navigate the next 12 to 24 months?
Right. Now, I think there's probably three things I'd ask people to really take away or to think about. And the first one, going back to what I said earlier, is really challenging the idea of what's impractical or what was thought to be impractical is now practical. I think oftentimes as an industry, and I know I'm as guilty as anyone else, we're saying, well, but construction is different, right? You can't do it this way, or that just won't work in our industry. Well, that's going to be continually challenged. And so as an organization, I think it's important to look at how we do things, operations, design, delivery, construction, whatever it may be, and really challenge some of those long-held assumptions to say, well, what could be done differently, whether we do it or one of our competitors does it. That would be number one. The second thing, as I said, was really this idea that bull markets and bear markets coexist at all times. Yes, we're likely headed into a overall decline in construction spending over the next couple of years. In Canada specifically, we're probably looking at a 20% decline in residential, probably a 10% decline in non-residential buildings, and maybe up to even 8% in the public sector infrastructure work. But no one chases 100% of that. So there are those subcomponents, like we mentioned, some of those that are really will be growing. That's double-digit growth over the next couple of years. So understanding, where those things might be and understanding that there are still opportunities. And then the third thing, probably following on both of those, both the question of, what's impractical versus now what could be practical, as well as this idea of bulls and bears coexisting. I'm reminded of a gentleman by the name of Pierre Wack. He was an executive of Royal Dutch Shell in the 1970s. Is considered one of the primary contributors to scenario planning from a business perspective. And one of the things that he would say is it's precisely in times like this, meaning heightened uncertainty, that the greatest entrepreneurial potential exists. And so it's taking advantage of things now. In fact, most of the contractors that we've worked with, when we look at the past recession and we ask them, what would you have done differently? The majority of them say, well, I wouldn't have done anything different. I just would have done it sooner. And so I think that's really kind of the charge here is take advantage. This is not, we're kind of past sort of the major part of the storm. Now it's time to really start acting and start working towards what that future looks like.
That's real sage advice, Jay. Thank you so much. I especially love the notion of challenging assumptions and trying to act faster and more agile and have a really forward-looking focus. But this is a really fantastic time for any business to invest the time in themselves as a self-health and a self-help exercise and really understand what it is that makes them tick and where they want to see themselves in the next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you, Jess.
Great to see you, Jay. Yeah, thanks for the time. Really appreciate it. We'll have to do this again. Hopefully, sometime soon it will be a non-virtual ground break.
That's right.
But really appreciate the time. Thanks so much, Jay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.